and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. Over the past few days, we have been talking about the Iraq War's 20th anniversary, but the United States did not learn from the mistakes of that war. Today we look at how the same approach led to the disaster in Libya. Next up, is there a smoking gun in the latest US banking collapses, and did US regulators decide it was too hot to handle, leading to the recent runs on deposits? And finally, in sports, the Women's Boxing Championship ongoing in India creates new fissure points between Russia and Europe. March 19 marked the 12th anniversary of the attack on Libya. Muammar Gaddafi's regime was overthrown, chaos reigned, Islamist extremists across the region were strengthened, and Libya to this date does not have a stable government. We talked to Abdul from People's Dispatch, who has kept an eye on the developments. Abdul, the invasion of Libya, now what are the impacts that we are seeing till today?
Well, everything is quite obvious. You see, Libya, which was one of the richest countries in on the African continent, a constant source of various kinds of aid and financial support to various poorer nations in the region, one of the largest exporters of oil and a sophisticated kind of regime in various ways, has become a kind of chaotic, non-governable, failed state. For last decade and so, there have been wars going on, negotiations and war. None of those negotiations led by UN or independently created by the allies in the country have produced a stable government. And the war continues, and even after the UN-led intervention last year, in a sense that political dialogue has not produced elections. The elections which were not able to, the interim government could not hold the elections because the factions were not ready, did not agree on different issues. So all of this basically indicates that the Libya as today is still suffering from the intervention or invasion, whatever we call it, in 2011, which was, of course, an intervention motivated to produce a regime change, to have a greater control over Libya's oil resources, and kind of to basically remove a government and a leader who basically stood against all the imperialist assaults and repeated imperialist assault. So if you see today, the overall Libya has become a hub, as you rightly pointed out, of different kinds of extremist group. It has become a hub of kind of human traffickers, who basically people from different sub-Saharan countries are basically brought in Libya and finally sent to European countries, leading to deaths of thousands of people every year. So all these things are happening in Libya, and that is primarily because of the US-led invasion in 2011.
Abdul, but it's not just also Libya, right? It's the entire region where Libya is, which has been affected. What have been the impacts of the US intervention, the US-led intervention?
Well, US, it seems, commits a mistake, claims that it has learned a lesson, but again repeats the same similar mistakes, and mistakes, if you want to call it.
Right.
It is primarily imperialist greed, which basically makes the US and its NATO allies to pursue certain kind of policies. We saw that in Iraq, invasion in 2003, claiming that the regime there is non-democratic, a totalitarian, a threat to the global security, and so on and so forth, led to chaos, led to a failed state for almost 2 decades. Iraq is still seeking to kind of have some kind of working democracy, some kind of working government, which basically caters to the rising concerns of the people. Despite the fact that it is a rich country, similar to Libya, in terms of oil production, it is one of the largest. It was one of the largest producers and exporters of the oil, And what we see today in Iraq is basically widespread poverty, unemployment, lack of water, lack of electricity, ethnic and sectarian conflicts, and so on and so forth. Similar things are happening in Syria. Again, though there was no direct intervention, what we saw that US and its allies backed certain anti-government forces, which basically led to chaos in Syria. They did it. They are doing it in Yemen. We have seen it.
Right.
So, of course, there are various other examples. Have been examples in history, and there are current examples also. So, all this basically proves that the imperialist greed, the urge to control world's natural resources, and without any consideration about the people living in those countries, about their lives and their security and so and so forth, basically derives these kind of interventions. And so Libya is one example. Iraq was before that, and several other examples. Afghanistan, by the way, we missed out, but Afghanistan is one classic example.
Right, Abdul. Thanks for joining us with that update. Does the kind of deposits a bank holds make it more or less susceptible to a collapse or a crisis? 5 years before the Silicon Valley Bank crash, regulators in the United States knew this was so. They knew that the nature of the bank's deposits, 90% were uninsured, made a run on its deposits likely or quite possible. But there's no indication that anything was done about it. That's what recent reports indicate. And Prabir Purkayastha, editor-in-chief of NewsClick, joins us in the studio with more details. Prabir, great to have you back on the show. So let's talk about Credit Suisse first. Prabir, is it related to what's happening in the United States, the crisis at Credit Suisse?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, particularly for somebody who's not a follower of finance and banking sector as such. Well, it is true that Credit Suisse was showing for last few years a situation that was of concern to the asset holders as well as the shareholders, as well as those who have a large number of bond holders. These are the three categories, if you will. And Credit Suisse is known for being an asset management company. The asset management doesn't seem to have done as well as it should, according to those who hold paper, essentially shareholders, bondholders, depositors. These are all the people who are there. But it was really more known for its asset management than for other banking activities. So that doesn't seem to have gone well. And therefore its stock price has come down quite significantly. It's been losing, therefore, stock value. And at one point it appeared that it would actually sink if intervention did not take place. It's a rapid fall of its asset value. The problem was compounded by the fact that the Credit Suisse, the biggest stockholder, a Saudi prince, he had refused to increase or infuse more money into Credit Suisse. So given that, it did appear that it was very shaky, and therefore now, first, of course, the National Central Bank, that extended some support to it, and also engineered takeover by UBS of the bank of Credit Suisse. So now effectively Credit Suisse has been merged with UBS as of now. Now the interesting issue is who takes the hit. Okay?
Right.
The shareholders of course do take a hit, but it seems the shareholders, unlike for instance certain other banks where the entire bank has been sold for $1 and so on, the shareholders took some hit. We don't know what's the amount of hit they have taken, but it is not that the whole bank has been sold for $1 or 1 Swiss franc. They are going to be partially compensated, so to say, that they will hold a certain percentage of stocks. It will not be, the stock value will be written down to zero. But some of the bondholders, apparently their bond value would be written off virtually to zero. So this is a strange occurrence in banking terms or in any other company terms, where the lender, which is what a bondholder is, comes normally before the shareholder.
Right.
But here the shareholders, shall we say,
Got
priorities
precedence, yes.
have been given over and above that of the low lender. So the first in the line, forget that, that's always depositors. The second in the line should be the bondholders. Third in the line should be the shareholders. In this case, the bondholders have become third and shareholders have jumped over it. So this is one of the aspects of the bailout which has drawn a lot of criticism. Does it mean that there is a different crisis of the banking sector in Europe? Is Credit Suisse an isolated event? Or is it something which is a larger event encompassing the banking industries both in the United States and in Europe? If you remember, in the United States, it started, the 2007-8 crisis started with Bear Stearns and then spread to Lehman Brothers.
Right.
And that's what became in 2007 Bear Stearns, in 2008 Lehman Brothers. This is when Lehman Brothers sank. That is when the crisis really hit the world, and that became a global crisis. So are we in the beginning of the financial crisis with what we've seen for the Silicon Valley Bank as well as the Credit Suisse, or is it the Lehman Brothers instance?
Right.
That is the big question at the moment. But as you know, the crisis in the US is not over with Silicon Valley Bank. There is the First Republic, which is also in crisis, and already a number of US banks have put in about $30 billion to try and bail it out. So the question that we have is the US crisis going to continue? Is it spreading to other banks? Is the US crisis now spilling over to Western Europe? Western Europe banks, are they going to be in a crisis? This is the question that is at the moment haunting the financial sector in the world, and also all of us are concerned, because if there's a financial crisis, it spills over to
Right.
to a much larger part of the economy. So we'll be watching, or we'll to watch very closely what's happening in the US, because it seems there are more events continuing over there, which can lead to spreading of the contagion that we are now seeing.
Right, Prabir, and thanks very much for that. The Russian and Belarusian flags flew as the World Boxing Championship began in India on 16 March. But it has not gone down well in Europe due to boycotts of both countries by competitions across federations. Incidentally, the tussle with Russia in the field of boxing began even before the Ukraine war, with the United States and its allies boycotting the International Boxing Association in 2019. Now the event in India has raised questions about the presence of boxing at the Olympics. We're joined by Siddhant Dani, sports journalist, with the implications of this. So Siddhant, there's this whole charge flying about that the IBA has not followed the IOC's orders. What is the history of these allegations?
So, Pragya, my understanding of the situation is that member associations that run various different sports are supposed to follow the International Olympic Committee's guidelines on various subjects, and that includes, in this case, the ban that the IOC has imposed on athletes from Russia and Belarus. But these are guidelines, again, much like, the court-issued guidelines, etc., that most federations are asked to follow. But it's not a rule, it's not a law, it's not something that has been passed by any kind of vote, and therefore it would go against the charter and the operating sort of principles of the Olympic Committee if they were to say that, without going through an actual democratic process, that all member associations covering all the various sports that are Olympic disciplines have to kind of follow the same rules. So what's happened in boxing is actually interesting, because boxing is headed by a Russian, Kremlov, who is also the head of Russian Railways and is a major figure in Russian sport. We know that the Women's World Championships of boxing are currently underway in New Delhi, India's capital, where you are at the moment, Pragya. And a bunch of countries have actually decided to boycott the IBA and all events that it is hosting. These are all qualification events, you have to remember, for the Paris Olympics that are to be held next year. So there's a bigger battle happening. The IBA had its own elections. There was an extraordinary congress held where a Dutch boxing official actually tried to take control of the federation, but that was not allowed. And essentially, they have now formed something called the Common Cause Alliance, which is an alliance of countries, I suppose, very similar to the list of nations who have who are support against Russia post its military operations in Ukraine. So they include many of NATO members and their allies. Although even there are differences. Australia, for example, one of the countries that is part of the Common Cause Alliance, is actually participating at the World Championships, and some of their boxers are likely to face Russian boxers as well. Russia being a fairly prominent nation as far as amateur boxing is concerned. So the scenario is essentially that the vast majority of international sport is controlled by the West, at least when it comes to decision making, office bearers, and such like. Boxing is an exception here, and so this is kind of a counterpoint. It is, I think, pertinent to mention at this point that unlike the ban that has been imposed by various federations and associations and sports on Russian and Belarusian athletes, no such ban was imposed by the IBA on any athletes. Anyone was allowed to participate. In fact, there was a Kosovar athlete. Kosovo is a country that India, for example, does not recognize as an independent nation for various reasons, and I think that's not part of the conversation today. But that athlete was told that they are allowed to come. They were given a visa to come to India and to participate, but not under the flag and with the anthem of Kosovo. So the athlete decided not to participate, and the president of Kosovo came out with a very vocal statement. But you know, so these are things. The IBA is not looking at a ban or throwing anyone out. It is trying to be as inclusive and look at what is perhaps good for the sport, but also to present a different perspective on how various sports are being sort of brought into the political sphere and being used as an extension of a conflict that is already existing on the battlefield, on the economic front, in terms of trade sanctions, other sanctions, banking sanctions, and of course sporting sanctions that we've spoken about on People's Dispatch before.
So thanks a lot for joining us with that update, Siddhant, and see you when you're back.
Sure, Pragya, anytime.
And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. You can visit our website for more such stories and watch our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.